Hello, AP Human Geographers. We are back at it for another lecture. Tonight is our second from our language unit, and we're primarily going to be talking about the Indo-European language family. But tonight is really about setting the stage for talking about all of our language families that we're going to look at in detail. And then we will start in with the Indo-European language family. So let's get started. First thing that we have to talk about is basically how languages move and how languages develop. And first thing that you'll notice there on the left hand side is basically how languages come to a new spot, how they diffuse. And this is a good spot to review some of our different types of diffusion, whether we're talking about relocation diffusion, whether we're talking about contagious diffusion, hierarchical diffusion, all these different types of things are important to understand as far as diffusion of language, diffusion of anything, but tonight specifically diffusion of language. And so let's go ahead and take a look. You'll notice we've got several different options there as far as how languages come to new places. Migration, war or conquest, colonialism is a very big one. That is one that we will talk pretty extensively about, even just in the next couple of minutes. Especially now with economic development and technology and the language of the internet. When we get to that later in, I think, 2 lectures from now, we'll be looking at the language of the internet and whether or not it mirrors the overall map of language across the planet. And then finally, trade. So different types of diffusion. Now, I also want to point out that languages change. New languages might come into existence, or variations of languages come into existence because of isolation. Isolation is such a huge thing, all right? Because if a particular area speaks the same language, and then through diffusion, those 2 languages become separated, become isolated from one another. They start to develop in different ways, and so if we take a look at 2 languages, and 2 languages have the same vocabulary for numbers, for colors, some very basic elements of language, we can see that at one point they were together, they shared a common ancestor. But then if they have different vocabulary for, let's say, technology that came about in the Industrial Revolution, and they have different vocabulary for that, well, we know that those languages had been isolated prior to the Industrial Revolution, so had to come up with their own vocabulary for this new technology that comes into existence. And so really important to understand that, because that's how we're able to point out when language branches come together, when dialects develop, and different things like that. So isolation, very, very, very important. It's part of the reason why there's so many different languages in Southeast Asia, why there's so many different languages in Africa. It's because of isolation, and whether that is physical isolation like in Southeast Asia, or more cultural or political isolation as we might see in Africa, doesn't really matter. It's isolation all the same. So our first map tonight, we're taking a look at the proposed Hertz of these different language families. So there's 4 here, and they're 4 fairly significant language families. Not necessarily the 4 largest, but 4 fairly significant and in different parts of the world. So let's take a look. Indo-European, you'll notice, is that dark green shade. So please notice the bubbles where these different language families are proposed to have began. These are the Hertz of these language families. Now, to make this a little bit more complicated, notice that the Indo-European Hertz is in what is now modern-day Turkey. We call this the Anatolian Hertz. But that's just one of the proposed Hertz of the Indo-European language family. There's another one, as we'll talk about later. In addition to that, take a look in Southeast Asia. They have listed the Malayo-Polynesian language family, which is actually a branch of the Austronesian language family. In addition to that, you can see there next to it Austroasiatic, another language family there in Southeast Asia. The red is our Afroasiatic language family, and that's going to include two fairly prominent languages of the Middle East, and that is Arabic and Hebrew, both part of the Afroasiatic language family. And then finally, the Niger-Congo language family there in sub-Saharan Africa, beginning in what is now modern-day Nigeria and diffusing south. And if you'll recall from our macrocultural regions, the Niger-Congo language family is the most dominant language family, the most widely spoken language family in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's go ahead and continue taking a look at kind of the diffusion of language as largely impacted by colonialism. So we'll take a look at first French. First off, let's ask the questions that we normally ask, and those are, what type of map are we looking at, and at what scale are we analyzing this? And you'll notice that this is a proportional symbol map or a graduated symbol map. Scale is kind of tricky on this one because you'll notice you can't see any political boundaries. So I would probably say we're best suited to say that this is a global scale because we don't see any political boundaries to differentiate as far as scale. Kind of a tricky one. Now remember, proportional symbol maps, the size of the symbol is proportional to the amount of data. In this case, number of speakers of a particular language, in this case French. So you'll notice that actually most French speakers are outside of France. And this is largely a legacy of colonialism. When we take a look at some of the places that France has colonized, had a number of colonies in West Africa. In fact, it was called French West Africa, including places like Cote d'Ivoire that we've talked about in class, where we still see French widely used as a lingua franca. It's used as an official language. Same kind of thing that we see in Quebec in Canada. Canada officially bilingual, largely due to the legacy of colonialism there. Once again, we could talk about, in this case, Portuguese, and still the legacy of colonialism. And as you'll note down there at the bottom, there's two major dialects of Portuguese. There's Brazilian Portuguese, there's European Portuguese. And so let's ask the question that we always ask. What type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing? And hopefully this one was a little bit more straightforward. It is still a proportional symbol map. Again, looking at the size, the number of speakers related to the size of the symbol. And in this case, scale a little bit easier than the last one because scale in this case is a national scale. We can see those political boundaries, but we can't see within those political boundaries. And so again, Brazilian Portuguese, European Portuguese, two dominant dialects of Portuguese. And a few years ago when they were trying to standardize the language, they ended up using a lot of Brazilian Portuguese because, as you'll notice from this map, there's more speakers of Brazilian Portuguese than there is of European Portuguese. And there's still a lot of Portuguese speakers in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly countries as noted there at the bottom, Mozambique, Angola, former colonies of Portugal. Alrighty, this map is super important. All right, so important in fact that you'll actually have to print out a copy from the website, turn it in with your map packet in class. So make sure that you do that. And the biggest reason why is because there's a lot of variation in color on here. It's a choropleth map, lots of different classes. And so we want to make sure that we're able to handle this information. And I'm going to tell you guys, I would say that any question that comes from this map is fair game. You should be able to answer just about any question that comes from this map. And I will tell you right now, there will be several of them on my test. It would not surprise me to see a question on the AP exam. We never know. All right. And so we have to be prepared to answer these questions in the chance that we see it. All right, so let's go through this just very, very quickly. We'll talk about some of the major language families that are on here. First off, the most widely spoken language family in the world is Indo-European, and that's kind of the lighter cream color that you see throughout the Americas, that you see throughout Europe, throughout Russia. You'll notice there also that Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, northern India, Bangladesh also speak Indo-European languages. All right, so not a surprise then how many people speak this, that it's the most widely spoken language family, when we see the geographic extent of it as well. All right. Sino-Tibetan is next. That's kind of the gold color that you see there, largely in China, but also in Southeast Asia as well. Afroasiatic, the most prominent language in Afroasiatic is Arabic, and we see that in the Middle East. That's the pink color that you see there in the Middle East, as well as into North Africa. Austronesian in Southeast Asia, Dravidian in the southern part of India. That's that kind of greenish color that you see on the southern tip of India. Niger-Congo, the most dominant language family in sub-Saharan Africa, an important note as well. Altaic is really kind of an interesting one, can be very, very divisive. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the Altaic language family. And the way that I always describe the geographic extent of Altaic, I say from Turkey to Mongolia through Central Asia. And that's that light green, kind of lime green color that you see there. And some of the controversy surrounds whether or not there's connections to Korean and Japanese as well. And so there's some controversy with regards to it. Some say that Korean and Japanese are part of the Altaic language family. You'll notice here that this map from our textbook does not include Korean nor Japanese as part of the Altaic language family. Both are independent language families. And so that's another important note to make. Khoisan, spoken in sub-Saharan Africa. Amerindian is going to be spoken in the Americas. You can see that largely in the interior part of South America, as well as the northern parts of Canada and into Alaska as well. So a lot of different language families. We're going to talk about a lot of these in detail over the next couple of lectures. So first thing, this kind of goes with the last slide looking at the map. These are just some of the language families that we talked about and some of the numbers that correspond with it. These are rough numbers, they're generalizations, they're not perfect. Indo-European is probably a little less than 3 billion people, but it gives us some context to this. And the biggest thing that I want to point out to you is that when we add up these 8 language families, and I would tell you guys right now, you should be able to describe the geographic distribution of each and every one of these, in addition to several others that we mentioned. When you add up these 8 language families, you're talking about 90% of the world's population speaking one of these 8 language families. If you recall from our first lecture in this unit, there's estimates put the number of language families at about 100. These 8 by themselves, 90% of the world's population. Which what that means is that the other 92, let's just cut it at 100. Let's say it's exactly 100. And again, there's discrepancy on that. The other 92 language families, only 10% of the world's people. Now, what that means for us, as we're going to see on the next slide, is that several languages have a huge number of speakers, but the vast majority of languages have very few speakers. And that puts those languages at greater risk of language extinction. So you'll notice there at the top, Indo-European, more than 3 billion, Sino-Tibetan, the only other language family with more than 1 billion speakers. So let's take a look at individual languages now. The most widely spoken first language in the world is Mandarin Chinese. Almost 1 billion people speaking it worldwide, the vast majority of which are in China. Now, that's perhaps not really surprising given the fact that China's population is so large. But what is kind of surprising on this slide is that the second most populous country, India, which will be the most populous country within a few decades, is not the most second widely spoken language in the world. Hindi, which is an official language in India, it's spoken by a large number of people. Only 300 million people speak Hindi worldwide, the vast majority of which are in India. But not everyone in India speaks Hindi, in much the same way that not everybody in China speaks Mandarin, but the vast majority do. And so, if you take a look down there, Bengali is widely spoken in both India and Bangladesh. And so we're going to see a little bit more language diversity in India, where not every one of the 1.2 billion people speak the same language. Now, what is kind of interesting on this slide is that whoever created this has Spanish as the second most widely spoken language in the world, which isn't consistent with the first slide or the first chart that we looked at from lecture number 1 that had English as number 2 behind Mandarin Chinese. And so that's an important note to make, is it depends on the source. In this case, this source has 390 million people speaking Spanish with 370 million speaking English. And so we have to kind of wonder, okay, are we talking about first language only? Are we talking about people who use it as a standard language? So we have to start asking some of those questions. And that's something I want you to do in your notes, is be asking questions, all right? Deep, thought-provoking questions, quick little questions, anything as we're going through. And on these slides, that's absolutely something you can include as part of these slides, is asking questions, asking for clarification, writing down other examples, things like that. This next slide is really kind of interesting because this is a proportional map of world language. And so the dark black lines that you see there separate different languages that are spoken. So you've got the biggest bubble being Chinese. You see English there, Spanish, Hindi, Russian. We've got a lot of different ones. Okay? Then, in addition to that, the smaller divisions within each are different countries. And then the color coding of which are going to be what region those countries are in. And so it helps us to see a little bit of the diversity that goes with these languages. Are they spoken in, multiple different regions? Is it really just one region? Is it really just one country? So these are a lot of the really interesting elements to this. And you'll notice I have the link included down there. So if this is something that you'd like to look at in more detail, you would certainly be able to. And if this were a map, it's a proportional symbol map, the size of the bubble being the size of the language and the country that speaks it. And it's right there in the title. Alrighty, so let's start out with Indo-European. Now, before we get into the specifics of Indo-European, its branches and whatnot, we should mention that there is a theory. Emphasis on theory. This is not proof. There's not evidence of this. It is a theory that suggests that there was a super family that existed way back before families diverged. And sometimes this superfamily is called the Proto-Indo-European or Nostratic superfamily. And the Nostratic theory suggests that Indo-European was combined with Afro-Asiatic, which is, again, the most widely spoken language there is Arabic. Dravidian, which we see in southern India. Uralic, which we see in northern parts of Europe, Finland, areas like that, as well as Altaic. So take a moment, flip back to your map of world language families and pinpoint Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Uralic, Altaic, Dravidian, and look how large of an area that would be if this superfamily theory had the proof to prove that it existed. but it doesn't, so that's important to understand. Right? As far as Indo-European, there are two different theories regarding the diffusion of Indo-European, and they match very much with the first slide from this particular lecture talking about ways that language diffuse. One theory is the nomadic warrior theory, spreading through war and conquest. It's called the Kurgan theory as well. A group of people called the Kurgans came out of what is modern day Russia, southern Russia, northern Kazakhstan, and conquered much of Europe, bringing with them their language as they conquered. That's one theory. The other theory is what we call the sedentary farmer or Renfrew hypothesis. And you can probably guess who came up with the Renfrew hypothesis, right? His name was John Smith. Nah, I'm just kidding. It was Renfrew. The Renfrew hypothesis states that Indo-European began in what is now modern-day Turkey, what we call the Anatolian Hearth. We mentioned it earlier this lecture, and diffused with agricultural technology. So let's take a look at those. So here are two different maps for the two proposed hearths of the Indo-European language family. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the Kurgan theory. Once again, that is the nomadic warrior theory, the idea that it started in southern Russia, northern Kazakhstan, and spread with this nomadic warrior group, the Kurgans, into Europe by way of conquest. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the Renfrew hypothesis, and that is the sedentary farmer hypothesis, that as agricultural technology diffused out of the Anatolian Hearth, what is now modern-day Turkey, it diffused into different directions. And this one has kind of an interesting theory behind it, because it kind of explains those two major divisions in Indo-European, the Indo and the European. Because you can see one is going south and east from Turkey into what is now modern day Iran and then into India. And then one is going into Europe. And so that's kind of an interesting theory. I don't know that either one necessarily has more support or the other. They may. But they're kind of interesting here. So be prepared that you might have to answer questions that come from either one of these. And to build on this is an article looking at proposed evidence that superfamilies did exist. This particular article proposes that 15,000 years ago in southern Europe, there was a super family, 7 language families together. And the professors that did this study looked at common words across these different language families, and they predicted that certain words would change less over time because of their importance. And so they came up with a list of predictions, and those predictions were similar. And some of the words that they said wouldn't change a whole lot were pronouns like I and we, words like man and mother. Though in the article, they also have an interesting one that they said didn't really change, and the verb to spit didn't really change a whole lot. That was kind of an interesting one, but really neat proposition that we could be on the verge of finding evidence of superfamilies. Now, this is going to have to be independently approved and agreed with by other scientists in the field before we start stating this as fact, but kind of an interesting and exciting notion all the same. As we transition and start to talk about some of our specific language families, this particular lecture, the last little bit that we have, we're going to be looking at Indo-European and specifically some of the major branches. And again, it is biased. I recognize that. I admit it. But I do think it might be more likely that we see more questions on Indo-European simply because almost half of the world's people speak an Indo-European language. So this visual, created by another geography teacher, kind of shows the progression And instead of using the hourglass shape that we talked about last lecture, in this case it just uses kind of nesting circles to show the progression all the way down to English. So Indo-European, the largest, because there's a lot more languages other than just English. And then we have multiple branches, in fact 8 of them in the Indo-European language family, one of which is the Germanic branch. Then you have the West Germanic group. There's 2 major groups, West Germanic and Northern Germanic. And then within the West Germanic group, there's actually a few more specific classifications as well that we don't necessarily need to go into. But then we can classify English. Now, what would be kind of interesting is, again, within English, we have multiple dialects. And within those different dialects, we have multiple accents. So again, that's where that hourglass shape comes in. So as far as Western European branches of Indo-European, we're going to mainly focus on the big 4 that are the most widely spoken throughout the Indo-European world. But we will mention a couple other branches as well. All right. As far as Western European branches go, Germanic, those are our 2 language groups below that. West Germanic, which is going to include German, Dutch, also not on there, English, Afrikaans, part of this as well. Northern Germanic is going to be Danish, Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, that are part of that as well. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see the Romance languages, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian. There are other Romance languages as well. Romanian is part of the Romance branch, kind of isolated in Eastern Europe, though. And there's other languages that are part of it. These just happen to be the big 4 that are most widely spoken. Should be also noted, and make a note of this somewhere on here, that also in Western Europe we see the Celtic or Celtic language branch of Indo-European. And we're going to see Irish Gaelic is the one official language of the Celtic language branch. We'll take a look at that in class. And then other branches of Indo-European in other parts of the world. The Balto-Slavic language branch of Indo-European, largely in Eastern Europe. And so we have a couple different groups here, the Eastern Slavic group, Russian, Ukrainian, the Western and Southern Slavic group, Polish, Czech, Slovak, that are part of this as well. Now, before we leave Europe, there's a couple other language branches that we should mention as far as Indo-European, and we mentioned them in the first lecture. Armenian, Albanian, and Greek are the other 3 language branches that make up Indo-European in this general area of the world near and in Europe. Finally, the last one that we have to mention is the Indo-Iranian branch. And this gives the Indo to Indo-European. And 2 major groups, the Indic group, Hindi being the official language of India, though there are, again, more than 400 languages spoken in India, so that's important to note. And then finally, the Iranian group of the Indo-Iranian branch, Farsi in Iran, is the most widely spoken language with regards to that. So next lecture, we will start taking a look at some of our other language families. I will see you guys next time. Have a good night.